can watch us on Facebook. What we'll do is, as soon as we introduce you, Tim, we'll let you conduct the presentation as you like, whether you want to have a talk first and then have questions, or however you want to do it. You just introduce us to the way that you would like that to happen. And then for those of you who are not here in person, please just raise your hand if you are in the Zoom room and would like to raise a question or a comment, etc. And those of you who are here, we'll pass the microphone around to you all. So Tim Alderson is the CEO, I believe that's your title, of Seeds of Hope. Wonderful name. It's a ministry of food justice in the Diocese of Los Angeles. And I believe today you're going to be talking about food justice and climate justice, maybe. So Tim, we had all of your bona fides in the program. So I'm going to leave it to you to just maybe introduce what of that you'd like to share with us as to who you are and your work, and turn it over to you, and just let us know how you want to engage your presentation this morning.
Yeah, thanks, Father Mark. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to hang out with all of you for a while and have some hopefully intriguing conversation. So the short version of my bona fides, if we're going to say that, is I grew up on the farm and in church, and I have a love-hate relationship with both. So that's the thread that weaves through my whole journey. And here I sit, very oddly having those two things conflated in recent years, and now I am farming for the church. So here we are. Just a tiny bit of background for those of you who may not know the story of Seeds of Hope. This project began in 2013, January of 2013. It was born out of an idea that our former, now dearly departed Bishop Bruno had when he was in the hospital recovering from leukemia, and first thought he was going to die. When it turned out he wasn't going to die, then he was feeling this gift of a whole new lease on life, and wondering how he would best use those extra years. And this was part of that, was identifying what the church could do, what role the church could play in addressing food insecurities in our communities, and the highly unfortunate health outcomes that go along with that. So that's how we started. We started with, I came back to him with an idea that I called Farming the Diocese, and it was a simple plan to merely repurpose unused or underutilized properties throughout the diocese to grow food. We have a lot of churches and other institutions. At the time, I think it was over 200 institutions. And I said to him, the one thing that all of those institutions have in common, apart from their primary mission, the work that they're doing, is they all have a physical location. And that means those are opportunities to grow food and get it to people who might otherwise not be able to have access to it. So we, as Father Mark said, we refer to Seeds of Hope as the food justice ministry of the diocese. Food justice, it turns out, is one of those lovely sounding things that can mean different things to different people. So our operating definition of food justice is universal, affordable access to basic nutrition. And it's sadly, a lot of people don't fall in that category of having that kind of access, either physically because they live in what we call a food desert, which means there's no convenient place to shop with anywhere near where you live, or economically, meaning it doesn't matter what's in the store, I'm going to have a hard time affording it, and most likely both. You have a hard time getting to the store, and if you get there, the choices are limited, and you're dealing with having to supplement your food budget with benefits like SNAP and so on. And even then, some people still can't provide enough food for everybody in the household to have all the food they need all the time. And a really sad reality currently with our housing crisis is, and we learned this through some research that LA County had commissioned. They brought the Rand Corporation in to look at some of what we were doing. And one of the things that they discovered was that the vast majority of people that we interact with who come to us for help are regularly having to choose between buying food and paying rent. So people are literally going hungry to avoid being homeless. And you can ration food, you can't ration rent. And so it's a very challenging time. And the odd context for all of that, well, I'll say this. I told you I come from a farming family. My grandfather farmed here in LA County and generations before that. And within my lifetime, so going back, a while, when I was little, Los Angeles County was still the top agriculture producing county in America. And now it is the home to the largest food insecure population in America. Things have just shifted in one generation in a major way. So we have people dealing with food insecurity. We have people trying to ration food to keep from becoming homeless. And in that context, nationally, we produce in this country 40% more food than we actually consume. So while there are people trying to figure out how to get proper nutrition on their table, we're tossing a lot of that into the landfill, where it turns into, it decays and produces greenhouse gases and contributes mightily to climate change. So that's the connection sadly, between food insecurity and climate change. So one of the things that we do, and we'll get into a lot of different things, but one of the things we do hits both of those things directly, and that is to divert some of that surplus food away from the waste stream, away from the landfills, and getting that directly to people who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. So we're able to address food insecurity in our small way, and address climate change in our small way by addressing those issues. So at this point, we grow food. I mean, there are over 90 little urban farms around the diocese. We have plenty of food distribution points, food pantries, meal programs, and so on. And then at Seeds of Hope, we also provide nutrition education, healthy cooking classes, and of course, we help congregations plant these gardens, these little farms, and help support the food pantries through distributing food. But we also now, I completely lost my train of thought because I was thinking of at least three things at once. Anyway, the other thing that we do is we have developed a few years ago a horticultural therapy program, which allows us to use a garden context to help people dealing with various kinds of trauma. So that looks like we help people dealing with the trauma of domestic violence, the trauma of poverty, the trauma of homelessness, and so that it's multifaceted what we do at this point. And of course, the food assistance is the biggest thing. And when the pandemic hit, food insecurity, as you can imagine, went through the roof. And so the demand for food went through the roof. I'm sure you all saw those videos on the news of cars lining up for miles to try to get food. And the demand for what we did quadrupled literally overnight. And it continues at that pace. In 2020, we actually distributed over 26 million servings of fresh fruits and vegetables, just us, just here in this county. And we are by far not the only ones doing this good work. So it's an interesting, challenging time. The pandemic and the response to it really had a giant ripple effect through the economy and specifically through the food system. A lot of things were learned. A lot of, there's always an upside to every downside. And one of the things is what we learned. And what we learned was where the cracks are in the system. It's really easy to be walking on a rickety bridge until it collapses. And then you find out, oh, look, there were cracks we could have, should have seen. So next time we build this bridge, we put it back, we're going to build it back better, which I just realized I think is President Biden's slogan, build back better. Isn't that it? I can talk all day, so says my wife, but I'm very curious to know the sorts of, whatever drew you into this conversation, I'm interested in that, and seeing if we can, if I can answer any questions, tackle any challenging issues, because even the simplest of issues turn out to be challenging sometimes when you recognize the multiple layers, and we run into this all the time in this work, where you have conflicting ethics. I mean, even within our own self, I might have this value and I might have that value, and it's hard to reconcile them. And so that's all fodder for interesting conversation. So I'll pause there and invite others into the conversation. Who will be brave and first?
Okay, Suzanne.
Well, when I go to the grocery store and I go to buy fruits and vegetables, I always go through them, okay, do these look pretty good, and then, oh no, those oranges don't look very good. I won't get them today, this week. And then if they do look pretty good, then I'll go through them and get the best oranges. How should things change so that people aren't just, so the things that aren't just the very tip top get picked? How do we deal with ugly food or food, oranges that are edible but not quite as juicy as this other orange?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and there's so many layers to that, right, that make it really complicated. And probably the most complicated layer is our own human psychology and how we make decisions. And so we're kind of wired up to do exactly what you just said, look for the best appearing piece of produce and choose that one. And as a result, a lot of things have happened because of that, and as a means of accommodating that, right? The first of all, grocery stores know this. That's why the first thing you see when you walk in the grocery store is the produce department, with all its bright colors and such. Even people who don't, turns out there's a lot of research on this, people who have no intention of buying fresh produce still have a warm opinion of the place when they walk in and they see that. And so customers drive the need for everything to be picture perfect. When you say orange, we all instantly have an image in our head of what a perfect orange looks like. It's literally an icon of an orange or a tomato or a banana. And without this isn't even like rational thought. We walk in and we match the thing we're seeing to the icon in our head, and the closer it matches, the happier we are to take it out of the store. So as a result, the grocery stores have to stock. They have to keep the produce section fully stocked of really pretty looking stuff for the overall sense when the customer walks in, but then also when the customer is trying to choose the item. So there's certain things that never make it to the shelf. There's certain things that get pulled off the shelf if they've been there a little, longer. And more now that stuff is getting donated. It used to just all get thrown out. And the other thing is demand. We expect to have everything we want whenever we want it in as great a quantity as we might want it. So all of those things contribute to surplus food or food waste. By the time it gets to the store, its next journey is usually to the compost bin, because it will have past its useful life, unless we can get it to people right away. Most of the donations that we get of food to distribute is through the wholesale produce industry, so it's much fresher than the stuff that makes it to market but doesn't get sold. So we have this, we just have this built-in quickie response of how do we really make decisions. Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink is fascinating on this topic. So it's the industry just responding to our own psychology and maybe manipulating it just a little bit for sales. So then this goes back then to the growers needing to choose varieties of, or breed varieties of plants specifically for physical appearance and durability, shelf stability, right? You don't want things to start rotting on you. And this is why you get tomatoes in the store that are perfectly round and perfectly red and beautiful and hard as a rock and tasteless, because those, tomatoes are pretty fragile and they squish easily. So these varieties have been chosen to to survive a truck ride from wherever they come from up north down to our warehouses and such. So all of those things contribute to food waste, right? So when the stuff gets harvested, it goes to the packing shed and it gets sorted, and only the beautiful stuff is going to even make it to market, because the wholesale buyer won't buy it if it's ugly, and they might buy a mixed load, a little cheaper. Some of it might end up in retail, but by the time it gets to retail, they're picking it and throwing it out, and then they're calling their wholesale broker and saying, don't send me that kind of stuff anymore. And so all along the way, we create food waste. There's food that for whatever reasons may not even make it out of the field because there's no market for it at that particular moment. Fresh produce is perishable. It has a narrow window of marketability. And at least in that case, they just turn it back into the soil and it becomes, it improves the soil. But then transportation, storage, retail, the biggest amount of waste happens when we get it, stuff that rots in our refrigerator or the leftovers. Same thing with restaurants. They serve us giant portions. A lot of stuff gets thrown out. So that was a very long-winded answer to what should we do about. Just be mindful of what we're choosing. Yeah.
Lucia has a question.
I was wondering why we haven't heard much or anything actually about the concept of gleaning. I mean, it's something that is biblically called for. It was something that was done primarily by the poor. And you were talking about waste in the fields, you would take care of that. And even gleaning from stores, because if you have produce, or wholesalers, if you have produce that's ugly, I know there's an app now where you can actually get ugly produce. They'll deliver it to your house, and it's like, it's okay, it's not bad, it's just not pretty, so
Right. Yeah.
there are ways to deal with that, and there are scriptural ways to deal with that, and I was wondering why we aren't doing that.
Well, it does happen quite a lot. It just obviously happens in rural communities where we don't live. So maybe it's not, maybe those efforts aren't publicized enough, but farmers definitely, if there's an opportunity to donate it, they will donate it. And if there are groups that will come out and glean it, most everybody I know, the farmers that I know, are happy to do that. And I'm working with a group of farmers in Orange County, and it's an organization called, well, it was called Orange County Harvest. It's now called Solutions for Urban Agriculture, but it's been around for 30 years and started exactly like that. A good friend of mine who actually, his parents come from St. Mary's in Koreatown. They're Japanese American that went through the whole the camps. Let's leave it at that. Anyway, he started years ago doing exactly that, working with local nonprofits when at the end of harvest, when there's stuff left in the field, let them come glean it and take it all. But then he went a step further and decided, well, and this is exactly what you're talking about in terms of the biblical admonition around gleaning. Instead of just leaving, letting folks come in and get whatever's left, he started planting 10% of his fields. So it was just literally tithing each field. And so all of that would get harvested and go off to distribution points. And now we've evolved to what we're doing, and this is fairly new. We're actually farming specifically to give all of it away. So we're going way, way beyond gleaning. We're now custom growing for Second Harvest Food Bank and Orange County Food Bank. And we intend to ramp that up. This is one of those things that came out of the pandemic, and when all of those farmers were caught with all this stuff in the field that nobody was going to buy, because everything, the whole system just, when all the restaurants closed, all that produce was piling up, and then the buyers weren't buying and the farmers, and so they were looking hard at ways to do something with that food, and systems were created. And at that point we realized, well, you know what, instead of just receiving toss-offs, we can produce specifically for that purpose. So there is a lot of that going on. Yeah.
The first one is regarding a barrier to nutrition that a lot of people on EBT might have, and that is, well, most of them are actually working poor, but they're in jobs where they have to be ready to come do a shift on a moment's notice, or they're given a schedule, 2 or 3 days ahead of time. And they're often working evenings, and the children are coming back from school, and they've got no dinner made for them. The parent doesn't have time to do that. And so they're stuck heating up SpaghettiOs, or at the best making some macaroni and cheese, which we all know are not healthy choices. The vegetables that we're growing and giving away are wonderful, but you can't ask a 9 or 10-year-old to do the prep work necessary to cook something up with those. So that's an issue, and I have no idea how to work around that. Maybe make some pre-prepped kits that we can give away, and the kids can just throw them in a pan and stir them up. I don't know. That's just a suggestion. And the second one was using delivery services for people who are in these food deserts, things like Instacart and DoorDash. And, we might be able to approach them and say, hey, these are EBT customers. These are customers of ours that are getting free produce, but they have no way to get out and get to where they need to get it. So if they have a delivery service that will bring it to their door, that would be wonderful for their nutrition. You mentioned the ugly produce. I actually subscribed to that for a while, but I found that the boxes were actually more expensive than going to Ralph's or Vaughn's and getting whatever's on sale. So unfortunately, I didn't really stick with that, even though I could afford it, but it didn't make economic sense to me. And there were other people that needed that produce more than I did. So those were my 2 comments.
Yeah, in your first comment about you described very well the challenges that families have. Sadly, the farther down the socioeconomic ladder people find themselves, the more complex everything is, and all these contributing factors complicate each other, right? So you did a pretty good job of illustrating all of that, and it gets to the point that, and this is what I always say, that food insecurity, I mean, yeah, we're giving food to people who need it right now. That's not a solution to anything. That's a triage. That's coming to urgent care kind of situation, right? Ultimately, food insecurity is an economic issue, right? I mean, it's just about, because like I said, we have more than enough food to go around in this country. The problem is it doesn't go around in an equitable way, and so we'll throw it away while people aren't able to afford it. But it's more complex than that, right? Like you just laid out, the reality of what it takes for parents to keep their kids fed. Well, sometimes it takes multiple jobs, and there are a lot of families in our community who rely entirely on the schools to feed their children. And we've expanded from school lunch programs to school breakfast programs, and it's very, very challenging. So if we're going to look bigger picture, we got to look at how we're going to create jobs in communities that are actually sustainable, that are living wage. That's the term I was looking for, not just a minimum wage, but a living wage that people can actually afford to feed their families and not have to work themselves to death in the process. In terms of home delivery, yeah, you're onto something that is a great idea, and we started doing that with some partners during the pandemic. That's one of the ways in which we got all that produce to people. It was not just them coming to a food pantry, but we have a partner organization on the East Coast. They're called Wholesome Wave, and they've done a lot of cool things. But one of the things we did together was exactly that. We got a second iteration of it now. We worked through a technology provider to create an app that would allow people to order food from home, pay with their EBT card, using their SNAP benefits, and then get free delivery. So it was especially important during the height of COVID, when a lot of people, it's another thing, people who live in poverty or even within a reasonable distance of poverty line also often have tremendous health limitations, often brought on by poor diet, but that made them more susceptible to COVID and more susceptible to a bad outcome with COVID. And so the idea I'm back. Sorry about that. It happens at my house.
Where are you?
I'm in Pasadena.
So, Tim, one of the issues I think that was raised by the last question, I've been reading this really interesting book by a journalist by the name of Amanda Little called The Fate of Food. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but one of the things she talks about is, she gives an example. This African-American couple, I think their name is Ruth and Michael. They have a farm, and they've been growing, it's a permaculture farm. They've been growing heritage breed produce and heritage breed livestock. The problem that they have, the frustration they have, is what they call the accessibility gap. And to your point, I think, Jerry, is that what they sell their produce for is out of the range of the price range of the people that they most would like to serve. And they love what they do. They think that what they're doing is important and gives a good sort of, they're raising the flag for more sustainable agriculture, but they also know that this is food for elites. And so it's frustrating for them also as farmers. I'm not saying that you have an answer for that, but could you address that sort of issue?
Yeah, that's one of those things that, you've got two ethical points of view that are irreconcilably in conflict with one another. The idea of producing food in this way and at that level of quality and taste and nutrition and environmentally responsible practices, and I assume they also are very responsible about how they treat their labor. And so all of that of necessity is expensive, and it's difficult to do all of that at scale. So it's sort of baked into the cake that stuff is going to be very expensive. And so, yeah, it's sort of a boutique kind of a way of producing food. And like any other boutique items, they're expensive. And there's, in any business, whatever widget your company makes, right? The company has to maintain some level of profit to stay in existence. And there's two ways of generating profit, right? Volume and price. And so if you can't produce in volume, you've got to have greater margins on each unit, so it's expensive. If you can produce in great numbers, you can make money on smaller margins, but you can't have that level of you can't be that attentive to every detail. It's expensive. So when I was saying earlier that food justice has many definitions to many people, early on, some of the organizations that I was working with Seeds of Hope, I discovered that their primary definition of food justice, and it's a fine one, is about these issues of environmental justice, labor justice, equity in terms of access to high quality nutrition. And those are all fine things. Our focus, and we work with other people who have different focuses, and then we can leverage each other's capacities to do more. But our specific focus is access, making sure people actually have the food, the fresh fruits and vegetables they need for proper nutrition. It's really challenging, right? So if everybody had equal, affordable access to fresh fruits and vegetables, those fruits and vegetables would have to be very inexpensive. And for us to do all of the other things that the couple you're talking about are doing, all those other things are great, they get achieved, but then the produce is too expensive for a lot of people to afford. So I don't know how to reconcile those things. I think it's wonderful that we have so much abundance in this country that people can actually shop according to their values, right? So that's a lovely thing. But that's shopping according to your values is a luxury.
Right. I mean, it's one that I try to do, but and I think that folks that have the ability to do it by engaging in it can in fact alter the market.
Yes.
Because there can be more production because people want it, right?
Yeah.
But in one sense, I'm wondering if the argument that you're making is an argument in favor of big ag.
Well, it's not an argument in favor of, it's an acknowledgement of the reality of. Okay, so once upon a time, and we'll go back 2 generations, when my grandfather was farming in what is now the city of Lakewood, it was no city, farmland. He farmed 15 acres and fed his family, at that level of business. And this is back, like I said, when LA County was the largest agriculture producing county in the country, and all these little small farmers, all these little postage stamp farms, these guys would load up their little truck, haul them into downtown, and you could survive that way. But that's also when we were growing food in LA County, which is very, climate-wise, very hospitable to fresh produce. And all of that great farmland is gone now, it's been built on. So we move into areas that are more challenging. The thing about farming, my dad always used to say that farming is the only business where you can do everything right and still lose your shirt, because you're at the mercy of the elements, right? And so farming, especially fresh products like fresh fruits and vegetables, as opposed to grain, things that can be stored for some period of time, they're perishable items. They have a very narrow window of getting to market. And so the market's very volatile. Sometimes there's a lot of produce and the price goes down, and opposite price goes up and so on, but there's a lot of things you just can't predict. And so it can be a boom or bust cycle at a certain size. So what ended up happening over time, and again, this goes back to our appetite to have every item, every day of the week, every season of the year, and these are family farms, but they just got bigger and bigger and have operations geographically diverse, so they can follow the seasons, so that you'll have tomatoes every day of the year, all the time, because they're growing it in a way that allows them to sustain a loss in one place that they can make up in another. So the size is really due to economic realities, and again, how customers drive, we want it cheap, we want it plentiful, and we want it pretty, and we want it all the time. So that's how those companies have gotten a lot bigger, and fewer and fewer people are interested in farming. And so now less than 1% of Americans are involved in food production. When my grandfather was farming, it was over 40%. I also don't have as much of a negative view of big ag as some folks do, having come from that world, spent my life working in it. Every industry has bad actors, but that's not the majority of the industry. Also, people conflate different types of agriculture, understandably so, if you don't really understand the differences. A lot of what happens in the Midwest, what we call monocropping, guys who just grow corn back to back to back all the time and grow it at scale, and it's subsidized by the government and all that. Very, very different than the fresh produce industry, which we mostly have in the Southwest, or the primary, so California, to a lesser degree, Arizona, Texas, Florida. The industry's had its issues, but I don't think it doesn't help to paint with too broad a brush in terms of understanding the industry as a way of understanding how it ought to be criticized, what's really wrong and how it ought to be better. Sometimes the conversation between urban and rural gets muddied when they're not talking about the same thing, or when people are making assumptions and then hurling accusations, then people stop listening, and then there's not a conversation. That having been said, though, and at the beginning of your comment, Father Mark, you were talking about our buying habits can change the industry, and that actually has happened early on. I mean, back in the 70s, organic produce was like a hippie thing, right? And nobody really took it seriously. And then customers started demanding organic produce. And then the mainstream grocery chain started wanting it, and the growers started growing it, and they started growing it at scale. In fact, one of the big vegetable companies, Grimway Farms, known for their carrots, they recognized that organic was highly in demand, and so they just went out and bought the biggest organic growers they could find and rapidly scaled up to 50,000 acres of organic produce. So it's at size, but it is by regulation, they've got to farm a certain way in order to keep that certification. So farmers by nature are very, at least in my experience, people I know, have a great concern about preserving the environment that they work in, caring for the resources that are there. You know, it doesn't do them any good to ruin their soil or dry up the aquifers or poison their labor or those things. There's a economic disincentive to do those things. Plus, most every farmer I know is a decent person who's trying to do things right. And I've heard them say, you know, we do listen to our customers. Sometimes our customers give us mixed messages, you know, because we want it this way and we want it cheap and we want it all the time. And it's like, well, okay. And one of the sad realities is that to grow organically consumes a lot more resources and produces a lot more food waste because, you know, there's not the addition of fertilizers and pesticides and weed killer and things. There's not the ability to prevent disease or pests or to deal with infestations when they happen. And growing organically doesn't produce the same yields. So you have to plant more acreage to try to get the same amount of produce, which means you're going to use more water, more land, and you're going to create more food waste because less of it will be marketable. So it is still more expensive than conventional produce. It's not as expensive as the stuff that comes from the folks you were describing, because organic produce is grown at scale. But so, you know, they can get the margins down, but there's also, you sort of scale up the waste. So it's, what are you going to do?
I was wondering about urban gardening in terms of, because I know I'm originally from Chicago and I moved back to Chicago in 2007. And one of the things that they were pushing heavily in Chicago is urban gardens. I know one place they took a warehouse and turned it into a hydroponic farm. Their community gardens are cropping up all over the place. And I have real strong opinions about the poor and their food and understanding the pathway of food. I've lived and worked in South Los Angeles and seen tremendous amounts of waste with regard to food and resources in general that I believe strongly people need to be held accountable for the resources they have and how they're used. So personally, that's one of the reasons I brought up gleaning. It's something that I feel many people in urban areas have really no concept about in terms of where their food comes from and the whole idea of waste. I mean, I grew up in a Roman Catholic schools and there was always don't waste food, waste not, want not, which is true, but that isn't always the mentality of people who can just go to the store and buy it. That's not always the mentality that they have. So what is your organization doing, or how can an individual cause people in areas like that to take more ownership over their food in general? I mean, community gardens are a great way to do it. If you don't grow it, you don't get it, that kind of thing. But there needs to be a greater connection.
Yeah, and that is the core of what we were up to when we started Seeds of Hope. Like I said, was to especially in these condensed urban spaces, is to use the church as a kind of shining light in that regard by planting food on our church property. In fact, we've got some fruit trees right there at St. John's that, you know, we've tucked into little spaces wherever we could fit them, and doing that across the diocese and giving people an opportunity to grow their own food. And not just, this is a corollary, but it's really important in terms of what you were talking about, is it's not just about, it is about growing food. It is about converting landscaping to edible landscaping, make the place beautiful and inspiring, and producing food and welcoming people in. But it's not just about giving food away to people or growing it for people. I mean, we do that, but here's the thing: people who find themselves in need of food assistance, there's a giant hurdle that has to be overcome for someone to even admit to themselves, and let alone anybody else, that they need help, right? I mean, we always say that nothing is for free. And in the case of free food, the price is a little slice of your dignity. And so while we're giving people food, we're also taking some of their dignity. And I hate that. Growing food together at church is a wonderful way to eliminate that piece, because people can come and work and help and not just grow food for themselves. So we don't really have community gardens where everybody has their own plot. We do what we call communal gardening, where everybody comes and works together, and we share that produce with our friends and neighbors through the food pantry. But those who come to work also get to take some home. And now it's not this sense of, I got a handout. It's this sense of, I helped my community and I got some food. That's huge. And the other thing is teaching people how to grow their own food, even in cramped urban spaces, because the cheapest, healthiest, tastiest food is the food you can grow yourself, right? You can cut it right off the plant and eat it right now, and you can choose whatever varieties you want. And we have a partnership with the Fullerton Arboretum. Another one of the great things about pandemic, if you want to say it that way, they now grow seedlings for us in the thousands, and we will distribute those along with the produce distribution. We'll give people plants, and then we do gardening instruction. It's possible to go to the store once and maybe never go again, right? Because you can go and get your produce. If it's anything, fruits, so anything that has a seed, you can save those seeds, you can plant those seeds, you can grow more, and then you can save those seeds and grow more, and you can share those seeds with friends, and it can be truly empowering for people who are exposed to it, to recognize they can take back a little bit of their autonomy and hold on to their dignity while providing that nutrition for their families.
But then you have to have the time to go and do all that gardening. Something I remember reading, George Orwell, the 1984 guy, was author, I should say. And he was writing about, I think in the 30s, and about the UK, but I think it's kind of might be applicable today. And he said, you can draw up these theoretical budgets of, how you can get this very nutritious diet on a small amount, buying oranges and carrots and so forth. But for people, whose life is very hard, they're not going to live on oranges and carrots. They're going to want to have ice cream, and have some treats, because, if your life is easy, then it's, much more easy to sit down and eat your fruits and vegetables. But, and so I just was thinking, I think a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very strong reality, right? It's, and I say this a lot about the kind of, the realm that we travel in, people recognizing the challenges of poverty and particularly the health challenges. And it's easy to say, well, just, they should have more fresh fruits and vegetables. And I always say, at some point you end up sounding like Marie Antoinette, right? Just let them eat produce. But you hit on the complexities of it, right? It's a lot of complexities, not least of which is exactly what you said. This whole category of comfort food, it's called that because it provides emotional comfort. It's different for everybody. It depends on, where you come from, what you grew up with, probably what mom used to cook, or the things you were deprived of as a child that everybody else had. We find our comfort in food, and we have to recognize that. And the sad part, though, is that in low-income communities, often comfort food is really the only real choice. And you know, sometimes what we do, and we had a really good experience one time at St. Timothy's in Compton. And one of the ways that they do fundraising is they'll have a fish fry, and everybody, you know, people from the community come, and it's so much a plate, and they fry the fish in the parking lot, and then you get all the good sides with it, you know, macaroni salad, and so you know, all the yummy stuff that isn't necessarily the most nutritious. And so we started coming alongside them and making fresh grilled fish tacos. And they were very popular, much more nutritious, and not any more expensive to acquire. It's just a matter of sometimes being exposed to alternately delicious treats, you know, that aren't going to give you a heart attack. So some of it is all that comfort food is habitual. It's when you're in a really rough spot and you just want, like you mentioned, ice cream. I just gotta have some ice cream. So some of it is just adding new habits. We talk to churches a lot about the quality of coffee hour, right? It's not about, I always say you got to learn addition before you try to learn subtraction, right? So just adding in some equally tasty, but perhaps healthier alternatives. But yeah, we all gravitate towards certain things that are not good for us.
Before Jerry asks his question, I'll just interject here. The Democratic candidate for the mayor of New York has just written a book where he now is advocating a vegan diet because he himself came out of a time where he almost died as a diabetic, and through changing his diet, totally transformed his health status. One of the arguments he makes to the African-American community is, you know, all of these foods that folks, because he's African-American himself, all these food that folks love. Do you realize that what you're doing is you're eating slave food? You're eating like an enslaved person. What you need to do is leave behind that, realizing that you're still back in Egypt or back in the plantation, and rethink what you're eating, and what is it that really gives you comfort. So I mean, it's a really strong argument, but it's an interesting one to think about.
Yeah,
anyway,
it's interesting how those foods, you know, where they came from, right? I mean, yeah, yummy things like pork ribs, right? I mean, that was just toss-offs, and some folks who received those figured out how to make some real yummy food out of that stuff. But same thing in the Pacific Islands, right, where there's a tremendous propensity towards obesity. A lot of that comes from during World War II, when they couldn't get a lot of stuff imported. Their diets became heavily based on rice and Spam, and that's comfort food in the islands, right? And it's very, very challenging. And yeah, that same conversation has been happening with the Pacific Islanders about where did that come from, and how their indigenous diets, if they go back to their own cultural foods pre-contact, there was no obesity in those populations, right? If you think about it, if you live in the Pacific Islands, you can get fish, you can get fruit. It's all pretty idyllic. It's warm all year round. And somehow adopting this Western diet, and the worst of it, just has created all manner of problems in that community. And it's true that both economics and, unfortunately, race are entirely predictors of health outcomes. So somebody put it this way: your zip code actually does, in large part, determine your health outcomes, and determines your lifespan. And that's a horrible thing to say, but the idea that people can sort of take back it's a lovely thought. It's a little challenging if you know, as we were talking before, in terms of what is accessible in the communities. A lot of communities, I mean, in South LA, I think the number 75% of the food that's available is available through a fast food restaurant or a corner store. And so that's convenience food, that's snack food, that's junk food, and junk food is designed to be tasty and comforting, and you can never get enough, right? So there's so many layers to what's stacked into the community that make it hard, you know, to be the Marie Antoinette of vegetables. But the fact that it's hard doesn't mean that we don't take it on, right?
Jerry has a question.
When I was a kid growing up in Chicago, even in elementary school, we had a teaching kitchen for home economics, and it was only available to the 7th and 8th graders. So I saw them going into the kitchen and making yummy stuff out of healthy foods, and I was really jealous. But by the time I got to 7th grade, the kitchen was closed. And it's just gotten worse and worse and worse since then. I don't see home economics anywhere in any curriculum. And I'm sad to say I'm old enough to remember when that was there, but it's disappeared. And there's a huge amount of ignorance. It's not just economics, but it's ignorance. And a lot of these people are second, third generation impoverished, and they don't remember grandma's good nutritious home cooking. They remember their mom's macaroni and cheese every day and every day every day. So they think that that's nutritious because that's what their mom made for them. So I'm a family physician, so I deal with that every single day. I grew up thinking, well, everybody cooks this way with healthy fruits and vegetables and everything. And I'm always shocked by the level of ignorance out there. And I don't use that word pejoratively. It's just they don't know. And it's shocking. We really need to rethink our values in school. And it's not just algebra. It's how do you make a good meal out of these vegetables that you're getting before they rot.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, sadly, you know, schools have had to cut back on anything regarded as extraneous, you know, and those kinds of programs went away with school budget cuts. And yeah, you know, we do have the opportunity to do nutrition education in schools in some places. And years ago, working with some other folks, we created the California School Garden Network that, among other things, we were able to put gardens in over 9,000 public schools in California, and along with that curriculum. But that required showing the state legislature research that showed that we had to show that academic benefit of it. You know, research that showed if you take kids and you teach them this curriculum in the classroom, and you teach them the exact same curriculum in a garden, and then you give them the standardized test. This is oversimplifying, but the kids who learned it in the garden perform better on the test than the kids who learned it in the classroom. And okay, that now the administrators start listening. But yes, I remember when we had home ec and shop class and all those things. All that stuff's gone, including in many schools, art and music. It's gone. You know, it's just it's a sad state of affairs.
I was thinking about what you were saying in terms of slave food. It's interesting because being African American, I grew up eating collard greens and macaroni and cheese. Actually, I didn't grow up eating collard greens because when I was little, I didn't like them. But macaroni and cheese and cornbread and candy yams and all that kind of stuff. As an adult, I changed all of those recipes. The first pot of collard greens I remember having that I really loved were my boyfriend's father. I called them Coronary Collards because he used a pound of butter, a pound of salt pork, and a pound of bacon.
Yep.
When the collards were at room temperature, the liquid turned to gel. And so they were amazing to taste, but if you ate them on a regular basis, you would have a coronary, just no doubt. So that caused me to really try to rework all of the recipes. And collards are incredibly nutritious. They're very nutritious if you don't drown them in fat.
Yep.
So, but the one thing I noticed though, as things became more, as it became more apparent that this was a great vegetable to eat, in South Los Angeles, the price of collards went from 3 bunches $1 to $1.50 a bunch. Now, it was the same green. I could on a holiday get 9 bunches of collards, because collards don't cook down the way the other greens cook down. They're a beefy green. I could get 9 bunches of collards and make a huge pot that I could like split between 2 holidays, freeze half and save it for the next holiday. Now it's like you're lucky if you can get one for, a single bunch for like $2. That's a tremendous amount of money when you think about how many people 9 bunches would feed versus buying 9 bunches at $2 a bunch. That changed the dynamic of that meal completely.
Yeah.
And it did it in a way that affects the people who would normally be buying and eating it. So it amazes me at how all of a sudden, once the label of nutritious, even if it's not organic, once that label is put on it, it doesn't cost you any more to grow it now than it did then. But the price is tripled.
Yeah, it's the challenge of something becoming a trendy food, and something when something's trendy, there's a premium that can be extracted, right? So that whole idea of you can make money on volume or on quality, or in this case, desirability. So once collards became hipster food right alongside kale, the prices went up, partly because of demand. Also, demand shifts to if growers are still producing the same volume of collards, but now there's this additional interest, then you get a certain amount of scarcity, and you can drive that product to markets where the price will go up, which means it's still going up in markets where it was always popular. And yeah, I mean, I assume that at some point the growers will begin growing more, but I don't know. That's the sad part of trends.
Eric and Kelly, do you have any questions, thoughts, observations?
I have a lot, actually. So, I get that we're in a crisis and people need to be fed, right? But it seems that we have a system that is primarily about the accumulation of capital rather than actually feeding people. And so I just kind of wonder, and the type of, in terms of accumulating capital, you make capital by growing soybeans, growing, corn for biofuels, and then, dumping the externalities on all of us. So obesity, degradation of soil, and on and on and on. And I just kind of wonder what to do about those big picture items. I know it's a kind of a huge question. Like, you're president, I'm going to make you president. What do you do in terms of agricultural policy to address those concerns?
Well, what I would do would ensure that I would never be reelected as president. I can tell you that. Because in a way, we are all complicit in what you just described, not intentionally so, but because our government, our food policy, sadly, you're right. Look, food policy that drives the Farm Bill is about what you just said, and it's not about nutrition. In fact, I was having this conversation this morning, texting back and forth with one of the guys that works for me, Steve. Father Mark knows Steve. And anyway, it got to the point in the conversation, I was just pointing out that the problem really goes all the way back to the Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill, of course, came about during the Great Depression, and it was an important necessity to support farmers for the sake of nutrition in the American population, but also for the sake of national security. You want to be able to provide for our society sufficient nutrition, right? So, but like everything, people smell opportunity and it gets, twisted and malformed, and we end up where we are today. So what you have is and it's odd because I grew up in California, the son of a farmer, fresh produce. That's what we grow out here in California, which is not part of the Farm Bill. There are no subsidies for nutrition. It's just all the stuff that you're talking about. So they corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton. The government will subsidize those crops. So the price is set, which means it takes the risk out of growing those things. Sometimes the government will pay growers to stop growing something in order to deal with surpluses. But then there's a giant surpluses. So then the government invests in research to figure out all the ways we can use those surplus products. So some of that looks like biofuels and stuff, but a lot of it looks like junk food. And then the Farm Bill subsidizes it on the back end because SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, what we used to call food stamps, is part of the Farm Bill. And so it gives people money to buy those things, which is just another farm subsidy. And so it is everything that's wrong with how we eat can be traced back to some kind of subsidy from the Farm Bill. And it was really messed up when, the USDA came out with the food pyramid, which really wasn't driven by nutrition research. It was driven by, we got a lot of grain that needs to be sold. So that was like, eat all this grain and all these grain products. And then that's how people end up obese and with diabetes and, the corn syrup and the soda and all that stuff. And the stuff that people should be incentivized to eat has no incentives in the Farm Bill whatsoever. So it's entirely jacked up. And the challenge with that is Bill Maher, the comedian, said one time, the reason we have an obesity crisis in America is because the first presidential contest is in Iowa. And big laugh, that's funny, but it's funny because it's true. You have all these politicians pandering to farmers who have gotten used to living off the government. My dad used to say, who was a hardworking farmer who had no such government support. He'd say, "Oh, those guys in the Midwest," he said, they're not farming, they're just farming the government. It's like, okay, well, the point being, there are these support structures for agriculture in the Midwest, and all politicians rely on keeping that vote. Politicians of both parties, whether it's at the state, national level, nobody wants to mess with that system. And so it would take an enormously brave set of politicians to want to come in and make the kind of reforms that would help support farmers in a better way, help incentivize farming practices that would be better for the environment, incentivize labor practices that would be better for labor, and incentivize purchases on the retail end that would support people's health. There would be a tremendous amount of good from knocking over one domino and having the rest of them fall, but that takes courage, which is sadly not a common trait amongst our politicians. They'd much rather just figure out what we want and do that, make us happy and get our vote. Or maybe not even us, the people who write the checks. Yes, our national food policy is jacked up.
We are coming to the time when we need to conclude, but a couple things that I'm hearing just in general are all of these various ethical questions that you raised from the very beginning, that there's multi-layers, right? One of them is the production of food. And it's beautiful food for beautiful people would be a way that you could junk food for junk people is another way that you could describe it. And how do we deal with that in terms of the way that the whole system has been gamed to change what you experienced a generation ago, from the family farmer to conglomerates, Monsanto, et cetera. That's one thing. How do we re-engage food practices to be more earth friendly as well as friendly to humans? That's another question. Those are two big ones. How do we get our supply? We don't have a supply problem. We have a distribution problem. How do we do that? How do we deal with some of the on the ground issues that Jerry raised about, mom has to work all day, and how does she get a meal on the table for children that's more healthy? And we can talk about that all day, but when you're on your feet for 12 hours and you have to come home and you have to put a meal on the table for your children, how are you going to do that? I mean, it's almost insurmountable on one level. But how do we as the church, we're supposed to be new creation citizens, right? Do you have any ideas about how we can actually start, I'm using a term from Kelly and Eric, homesteading for the new creation. How do we homestead for the new creation? Either as a model, which I think you're doing in Seeds of Hope, or changing policy. Do you have any just brief, giving you all that stuff, but just briefly responding to any of those many issues?
Yeah. Thanks, Father Mark. In a brief summation, I will now solve all the world's problems related to food. Get out your notepads. It's going to be great. No, you've exactly lined it out, and it is big and it is overwhelming. And I've said from the beginning of Seeds of Hope, when you lay it all out like that, it seems overwhelming. So you ask the question, can the church solve this problem? And the answer is no. But the fact that we can't solve the problem doesn't absolve us from doing the part that we can, right? So I think each congregation can look inward at the community that is the congregation and identify where the passions are and where the skills are and where the experience and the expertise is. And you'll begin to identify what capacities you have and where the energy lies. Because like you said, you can come at this a million different ways. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think finding the unique purpose of your own congregation is the place to start. And I think also, I think we need to start and by looking inward at which parts of these challenges are we individually contributing to, because the most important and I think easiest and most immediate change we can make is within ourselves individually and as our close-knit group, right? So that's the before you focus on the speck in your brother's eye, take the log out of your own. So what's the log in our eye? Where around these issues, right? What are we doing? How can we do it differently? So the things that we have encouraged congregations to do from the very beginning, in fact, we adopted in 2013 at convention a diocesan food policy that gives direction around these things, what congregations can do. One of those things, if it's possible, and there's the capacity, is growing food, converting landscaping to edible landscaping, creating beautiful, welcoming spaces, but producing food. There's a number of layers of benefit there, the most obvious which is sharing food with people who need it, but another way of welcoming community into church. And when we talk about these, like national food policy, we can look at congregational food policy, right? If you want, Father Mark, I'll email you a copy of that so you don't have to go looking for it. It might be something that you guys would look at as a diocesan policy and say, well, okay, there may be something in here that we can do. And it may also then go beyond congregation. You may find, I don't know, that some folks in your congregation are really wired up to social justice and, pitchforks and torches and such. I don't mean that disparagingly, but I mean, taking on the fight, and identifying policy issues that you are knowledgeable about or can become knowledgeable about, and then getting in the fray around those things. So it's kind of like that old story about a guy who goes out for a walk on the beach, and as he's coming over the rise and sees the beach, he sees the entire expanse of sand is covered in starfish, and there's a little boy out there on the beach, and he sees him picking up starfish and throwing them back in the ocean one at a time. So he walks down to the boy. He says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm saving the starfish." He said, "Look at this beach, kid. There's thousands of starfish out here. It's just you. There's no way that you can make a difference to all these starfish." Kid bends over, picks up another starfish, throws it in the ocean. He said, "I made a difference to that one." And so I think we come at it with that mentality. It's too big to solve, but it's too big to ignore. So find your own passion, your own capacity, and that will be the right thing to do. I always say, I put it like this as an equation: need plus capacity equals responsibility. When you look out the doors of the church into your surrounding community and you identify what are the pressing needs, and then you look internally at your congregation, you identify the capacities that you have to address those needs in some way, then that intersection is where your work is. That's where you find, the responsibility. So it doesn't have to be a big darn drag. It can actually be stuff that's really enlivening and energizing when you have discovered your own unique, special way to engage. And it gets powerful when it's like that.
Great. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah.
If you could send that policy to us, that'd be great. So like
Sure.
you say, I don't have to go searching for it.
No.
The
Right. As soon
other
as we're done, I'll
question is-
email it to you.
The other question is, in the before times, we had had a lot of connection with Seeds of Hope, with folks coming to do some nutrition classes and all that sort of stuff. We would love to re-engage that relationship and find ways that we can do that and more. So how best can we engage that conversation?
You just did it, which is great.
Okay.
As you know, back when we were doing it before, we had specific funding that covered that program, and that went away. But we do have a whole new funding for, in partnership with the City of Hope, Seeds of Hope. We created a program called Roots of Hope. Very hopeful people, it turns out, which is a diabetes prevention program, a faith-based diabetes prevention program that is recognized by the CDC. And that allows us to do stuff very similar to what we were doing before, but to engage people over a long haul in helping them prevent diabetes, and then also people who are dealing with diabetes, helping them improve their nutrition so they can reverse that in the proper direction. So that is something that we can do at St. John's. So I will, and Steve is running that program. So I will do two things as soon as we're done. I will email you the diocesan food policy, and I will send an email to you and Steve about starting a conversation this coming week.
Thanks, Tim. Always
Yeah.
good to see you and have these wonderful conversations. So
Yeah.
thank you. We all want to give you a thanks for being here today.
Thank you. I enjoy these kinds of very engaging conversations about
Great.
difficult things. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And we'll see you soon, I'm sure.
Yes. All right. Thanks.
For those of us who are remaining here, next week, for the next 2 weeks, we're going to, through the month of October, have something totally new and different. We're going to be engaging in Ignatian imagination contemplation. We're going to look at gospel readings and engage the text from using our imaginations and placing ourselves in the stories. So we're going to try that for the next 2 weeks during this time, since we have sort of a gap time. So next week. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here.